Carl and Marlene Edmonds never meant to make headlines. But one quiet Texas night, with their 3 children in the back of a van, they turned an ordinary traffic stop into one of the strangest and most chilling mysteries the town of Redwater had ever seen. It was one of those quiet summer evenings in Redwater, Texas, when the heat lingered long after the sun had set. The streets shimmered beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, and the sound of crickets filled the air like background music. Officer Dale Murphy sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, cruising along Highway 17, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. It was shaping up to be an uneventful night, the kind he secretly preferred. Redwater wasn't known for trouble, It was the kind of town where people still waved to each other from their porches, where the biggest excitement usually came from a high school football game or a lost dog found safe and sound the next day. As he drove past the open fields, his headlights caught a glint of silver ahead, an old minivan drifting slightly between lanes. At first, it didn't seem like much. Maybe the driver was tired or distracted. But after a few moments, the weaving got worse. Officer Murphy frowned, straightened his posture, and tapped the switch on his dash. Blue and red lights flickered to life, casting long streaks across the empty road. The van hesitated, slowed down, and finally pulled onto the shoulder near a row of dark pine trees. Murphy pulled up behind it, noting the faded paint, the cracked rear bumper, and the clutter visible through the back window. Blankets, a cooler, and a few plastic bags. It looked like a family coming back from a trip, maybe camping. Nothing unusual. Still, something about the way the van had been moving didn't sit right with him. He ran the license plate number through the computer, and when it came back clean, he stepped out of the car. The night air hit him, heavy and warm, carrying the faint smell of pine and dust. He approached the driver's side slowly, flashlight in hand, watching for movement inside. As he got closer, he saw 5 people. A man behind the wheel, a woman in the passenger seat, and 3 teenagers in the back. The glow from his flashlight bounced off their faces, and for a moment, everything looked ordinary. The man appeared calm, maybe a little nervous, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The woman looked straight ahead, expression unreadable. The kids sat quietly, not saying a word. Murphy's training told him to stay alert, but he reminded himself that families often acted tense during traffic stops. Still, the silence was strange. He'd been on the job long enough to recognize when something felt off, and this family felt off. It wasn't just nerves. There was a stillness in the air, like they were holding their breath. He reached the window and gestured for the driver to roll it down. The man hesitated, then complied, the glass squeaking as it slid open. Murphy introduced himself, explained why he'd pulled them over, and asked for the usual documents. License, registration, proof of insurance. The man nodded slowly, eyes fixed ahead, and reached toward the glove box. His hands trembled slightly. The officer's flashlight followed the motion, expecting the familiar shuffle of papers. But what came out wasn't paperwork at all. Just a plain white envelope, sealed and slightly crumpled, as though it had been opened and closed too many times. Murphy frowned, uncertain. The driver handed it over without a word. Inside the patrol lights, the family remained unnervingly still. The teenagers stared blankly at the dashboard, the woman's hands folded tightly in her lap. The air felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name. The officer glanced at the envelope, wondering if it contained an ID or some explanation. He had stopped dozens of cars before, but for reasons he couldn't explain, this one made his heart beat just a little faster. Something about that van, that family, and that envelope whispered that this night was not going to end like all the others. When Officer Murphy opened the envelope, the first thing he noticed was how old the paper looked. It wasn't fresh or new, but yellowed slightly, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. Inside, there wasn't a license, registration, or any other document. There was only a single piece of lined paper, torn from a notebook, with one sentence written in shaky handwriting: "Do not trust the people in this car." For a few seconds, he just stared at it, confused. The words didn't make sense. He looked up, expecting the driver to explain, but the man behind the wheel kept his gaze locked straight ahead, face pale and expression blank. The silence grew thicker, The kind of silence that doesn't just fill the air, but presses down on it. Murphy tried to stay calm. Maybe this was a prank. Or the driver was trying to play some kind of strange joke. But when he looked closer, the man's hands were trembling on the steering wheel. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, even though the night air wasn't hot enough for that. The officer took a slow step back, his instincts beginning to hum in that quiet, warning way that every cop learns to listen to. He glanced at the rest of the family. The woman in the passenger seat sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the windshield. She didn't blink or move. Her jaw was tight. And her fingers dug into her knees like she was holding something in. In the back seat, the three teenagers sat completely still. One stared out the window, while one looked down at their lap, and the other was frozen mid-turn, as if caught between looking at the front and the side. None of them spoke. None of them made a sound. Murphy's flashlight swept the inside of the car again, and that's when he noticed something else strange. The floorboards were covered with dirt and pine needles, the kind you'd pick up from walking through a forest. But the van's tires were clean, no mud, no dust, no sign they'd been off-road. It was like the forest had followed them inside. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder, breaking the silence for a moment. He reached for it, but hesitated. Something in his gut told him to wait. He took a small step forward and asked where they were coming from. The driver didn't answer. He didn't even blink. The officer asked again, a little louder this time, his voice carrying a note of unease. Still no response. The woman's lips moved slightly, like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. She just turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes glassy, unfocused. A chill ran up Murphy's spine. He'd seen strange things during night shifts before. People drunk, high, confused, or scared. But this was different, There was a look in her eyes that didn't belong to someone who was simply frightened. It was emptiness, like the light inside her had gone out. He took a step back, keeping his hand near his holster, not because he expected violence, but because something about this family felt unpredictable. He looked down at the note again, at those 7 words written in desperation, and suddenly they didn't feel like a joke. They felt like a warning. Then, just as he was about to call for backup, the van shuddered. The engine roared to life on its own, headlights flaring bright against the trees. The driver's foot slammed on the gas. But the car didn't move forward. It jolted, then stopped, the engine sputtering before settling into a steady hum. Inside, the family all turned their heads at once. Eyes shifting toward the officer, perfectly in sync, their expressions still blank. For the first time that night, Officer Murphy felt real fear. He couldn't explain it, couldn't find the words for why, but something told him this wasn't a normal family, and this was no ordinary traffic stop. The roar of the van's engine echoed through the still night, shattering the quiet that had hung in the air. Officer Murphy stepped back, one hand instinctively on his holster, the other reaching for his radio. The headlights flared brighter, washing the trees in a harsh white glow. Inside, the family was moving now, but not in any way that made sense. The woman in the passenger seat started rocking back and forth, her hands pressed tightly against her ears. One of the teenagers began pounding on the window, his fists hitting the glass in a steady rhythm. Another tilted her head back and started shaking as if caught in some silent scream. Murphy's training kicked in. He raised his voice, ordering them to stop, trying to get control of the situation. But his words didn't seem to reach them. The noise inside the van grew louder, thuds, scraping, muffled gasps, while the engine idled like it was waiting for a signal to move. He stepped closer, peering inside, and saw the driver's seat was empty. His heart slammed against his ribs. Just moments earlier, the man had been sitting right there, hands gripping the wheel. The door was closed. The window was up. There was nowhere he could have gone. He circled the van, shining his flashlight along the road, half expecting to see the man stumbling into the trees. But the beam showed only the narrow strip of asphalt and the dark pines stretching endlessly on either side. No movement. No sound except the faint hum of the idling engine. When he looked back into the van, the scene had changed again. The woman had stopped rocking. The teenagers were still. They sat there, perfectly still, their heads slightly tilted downward as if they'd fallen asleep sitting up. The sudden calm was worse than the chaos. Murphy's chest tightened. Jewel. Something about the silence pressed in on him. He called for backup, voice low but steady, giving his location and describing what he could. The dispatcher asked if anyone was injured. He hesitated. How could he even explain what he was seeing? Before he could answer, one of the teenagers lifted his head. His face was pale, eyes wide open and unfocused. His lips moved, forming words Murphy couldn't hear through the glass. Then he started to smile, slow, unnatural. Like it didn't belong on his face. The radio hissed in Murphy's ear, but he didn't hear the words. His focus stayed on the van. Every instinct told him to back away. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He was watching something he couldn't understand, and a part of him needed to make sense of it. The headlights flickered once, visual, then twice, and the engine gave a low sputter. The van lurched forward just a few feet, then stopped again. By the time backup arrived, the scene had gone eerily still. 2 other patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue across the empty stretch of road. When the other officers approached, the Murphy motioned for them to stay quiet. He pointed to the van. The family was still inside, motionless. The woman's hands were folded neatly in her lap. The teenagers stared blankly ahead. None of them reacted to the new lights or the sound of the sirens. One officer tapped on the window, but there was no response. Another tried the door handle. It was unlocked. They opened the door slowly, half expecting someone to scream or lunge forward. Instead, all 5 family members were slumped in their seats, breathing shallowly, as if they'd all just drifted into the same deep sleep. Murphy leaned in, scanning the dashboard and seats. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing broken. Only the smell of pine and something faintly metallic that he couldn't quite place. He looked at the empty driver's seat again, the one where the man had vanished, and his pulse quickened. The seatbelt was buckled. The indentation in the cushion was still warm. Whoever Carl Edmonds was, he had disappeared in less than a minute, and no one, not even his family, seemed to know where he'd gone. By the next morning, the quiet town of Redwater was buzzing with rumors. Word spread fast that something strange had happened out on Highway 17. People said a whole family had gone unconscious during a traffic stop, that the father had vanished into thin air. The official report was vague, but everyone in town seemed to know at least a piece of the story. The Edmonds family wasn't unknown in Redwater. Carl, the father, worked at a hardware store on Main Street. His wife, Marlene, taught art at the elementary school. Their 3 kids went to Redwater High, and by all accounts, they were normal, friendly people. So when the news broke, no one could believe it. Detectives searched the van for clues. They found no signs of foul play, no drugs, no alcohol, no weapons. But the odd details kept piling up. There were pine needles scattered on the seats, despite the van never leaving the highway. There were also a few torn pieces of paper tucked into the glove compartment, each covered in strange writing. Most of the sentences were incomplete. Fragmented thoughts scribbled in uneven handwriting. Phrases like, "They're watching from the tree line," and "Don't look directly at them." None of it made sense. When officers went to the Edmonds home to gather more information, what they found deepened the mystery. The front door was unlocked, but everything inside looked frozen in time. The dining table was set for 5, plates still in place as if the family had just walked away mid-meal. Mail had stacked up on the porch, and the answering machine blinked with unheard messages. But the most unsettling discovery was upstairs in Carl's study. Every wall in that small room was covered in papers, maps of Redwater, hand-drawn symbols, and dozens of photographs. Some were pictures of the woods near their home, while others were zoomed-in shots of parked cars and unfamiliar faces. He had labeled each one with notes like, "Seen again at 3:12 p.m." or "Different car." Same person. It was clear Carl had been keeping track of something, convinced he was being followed. In the corner of the room sat an old cassette recorder. When investigators played it, the tape was mostly filled with static, but every so often, Carl's voice could be heard, low and tense, saying things like, "They're closer now," and, "If they find this, it's already too late." The final few seconds of the tape were nothing but heavy breathing and a sound that resembled wind rushing through leaves. Marlene's coworkers told detectives that she had mentioned Carl acting off. In the weeks leading up to the incident, he had stopped sleeping. Jewel started covering the windows with newspaper and insisted the family stick together at all times. He'd told his wife that something had followed them home after their last camping trip, something that wasn't human. She thought it was stress or exhaustion, but his paranoia only grew worse. What investigators also discovered that Carl had withdrawn a large sum of money from the bank 3 days before the traffic stop and bought supplies, flashlights, rope, canned food, and a portable radio. It looked as though he had been preparing to go somewhere or hide from something. But no one could find where that money went or what his final plan had been. When the family woke up in the hospital later that week, none of them remembered anything from the night of the stop. They couldn't recall what had happened on the highway, what Carl had said, or when they last saw him. Each one told the same story. They'd been driving home from a trip. Carl had been quiet, and then everything went black. It was as if their memories had been wiped clean. And the more police dug, the less they understood. Every answer only led to more questions, and the truth about what happened on that road was slipping further out of reach. 2 weeks after the strange traffic stop, the search for Carl Edmonds was called the largest in Redwater's history. Dozens of officers, volunteers, and tracking dogs combed through the woods that lined Highway 17. Helicopters scanned the thick forest, and divers searched the Redwater River, which ran less than a mile from where the van had stopped that night. For days, they found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. It was as if Carl had stepped out of existence. Then, on the 10th day, a fisherman found something near the riverbank. A leather wallet and a set of keys tangled in reeds. Inside the wallet were Carl's ID, a few dollars, and a faded photo of his family. There were no bloodstains or damage, but the photo was damp, the ink beginning to blur. Investigators followed the faint trail of footprints leading down to the edge of the water, but it ended abruptly. No footprints came back. The official theory became that Carl had drowned, though no body was ever recovered. While police worked to close the case, the rest of the town couldn't stop talking. Some said Carl had gone insane, that he'd imagined the whole thing. Others believed he'd staged his disappearance, but people who had known him well refused to accept that. They said Carl was steady, quiet, and good-hearted, not the kind of man who would vanish and leave his family behind. Still, the evidence didn't lie, Every scrap of paper in his study pointed toward a mind unraveling. The Edmonds family was released from the hospital with no clear answers. Marlene looked pale and withdrawn, her voice faint whenever she spoke to reporters. She said the doctors told her the memory loss might fade with time, but months passed, and nothing returned. The teenagers struggled to go back to school, haunted by nightmares they couldn't explain. They said they sometimes woke in the night, convinced someone was standing outside their window watching. Late one evening, Officer Murphy stopped by their house to check in. The lights were on, but the blinds were drawn tight. The family seemed polite but distant, moving slowly, almost cautiously. When he asked if they had remembered anything new, Marlene shook her head. But as he was leaving, he noticed something on the porch. A folded piece of paper weighed down by a rock. He picked it up, expecting maybe a thank you note. It wasn't. In the same shaky handwriting he'd seen before were the words, "He's still in the trees." The note was logged into evidence, but no one could determine who had written it. The handwriting didn't match Marlene's or any of the children's. The forensics team confirmed it was a perfect match to Carl's writing. The unsettling part was that the paper was dry and clean, untouched by the recent rain. As if someone had placed it there only moments before Murphy arrived. Years later, the story of the Edmonds family became something of a legend in Redwater. Truckers driving along Highway 17 at night claimed to see a figure standing on the shoulder. Tall, wearing a work shirt, motionless in the darkness. When their headlights passed, the figure was gone. Some said it was Carl's ghost, still searching for something he'd lost. Others believed he was alive, watching from the forest he'd been so afraid of. The police eventually closed the case, labeling it an unresolved missing person investigation. The official report ended with the words, "Presumed deceased." But among the officers who had been there that night, none of them ever forgot the feeling. That thick, silent dread that had settled over the road when the van stopped. Officer Murphy retired a year later. He said he'd never seen anything like it before, and he hoped he never would again. Yet sometimes, when the nights were quiet and the wind carried through the trees just right, he swore he could still hear the faint hum of an idling engine somewhere out on Highway 17.